And our next speaker is Alexander Ehlers, who has lectured jurisprudence in the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria and worked as a researcher on socio-economic rights and mining-affected communities with NGOs. He currently works on legal and philosophical aspects of land reform and privacy protection while pursuing postgraduate work. Now, Xander writes in his personal capacity, and today he is going to tell us why land use and affordable housing policies need to be reformed in order to desegregate the city. Thanks, Xander.
Thanks very much. All right. Thank you so much, Yolanda, for the invitation and for putting together this wonderful event, to all of the organizers as well. So any person who works in, not even works in South African urban design and spatial design, or has an interest in that, but any person in South Africa will know a scene like this. So this is Primrose and Makause in Johannesburg, two suburbs. So segregation is still a central feature of the South African urban landscape. So yes, it's still extremely racialized. We've got the apartheid history of racial segregation, but really there are many levels of segregation. And the central question really is 30 years after apartheid and even longer, and in a longer space of time, many apartheid, spatial apartheid legislative instruments repeal. Why do we still sit with this enormous problem of segregation? So we're obviously with the central question in mind that anyone would have. I had the opportunity of reviewing the draft Tshwane land use scheme. Tshwane is the municipal name for the South African capital, Pretoria, and it's sort of the greater Pretoria area. And two maps struck me in the land use scheme. Now, the land use scheme is really the town planning scheme. So here we have Waterfall Bridge. And obviously accompanying this map is lots of rules, town planning rules for certain zoning arrangements that are made that tell you can't have this kind of use in an area. And yes, obviously that's visible on this map. But another thing that is very obvious on this map is the kind of a uniformity in land plot sizes. So the residential land plots here all have a minimum size and a maximum density that's enforced through sort of coverage caps and those kinds of things. Now, if you compare that with this map, which is the map of Sunnyside.
Xander, I'm just going to interrupt you briefly. Your maps aren't we can't see your slideshow. So we're still stuck on the first map. I don't know if you can see, we just, yes, now it's moving. Okay. Sorry to interrupt you.
Let me rather do this. I'll rather use this rather than the presentation. I wonder if it thinks there's a different.
It actually moves now, so we can see the different maps. Perfect.
Okay, doke. So this is the Waterkloof Ridge map that I spoke about earlier, and this is the Sunnyside map. So immediately, what struck me about these maps is a couple of reasons. So there's a great diversity here in Sunnyside that you don't see. Perhaps we can just go get to its scale. This is a roughly sort of scale matched comparison of two parts of that map. So there's a great diversity on the right in the Sunnyside map. Despite there being any indication here of mixed use. So to me, what I want you to see here at the moment is that it's not a mixed use issue necessarily, just a mixed use area. So mixed use just means that it's not just a residential area. There might be a corner shop allowed and a hairdresser and whatever. Yes, of course, that is at work here. But even in mixed-use developments, we still see economic, and again, because economic segregation has this racial historical component with it, racial segregation in newer mixed-use developments, all across the city, whether it's Hatfield or in the new further east developments like Mendon Main or whatever, you still see this segregating effect. So I don't think that mixed use really nails what is the segregating issue here. What you can see here is the mixture in the forms that goes along with mixture of uses. So in Sunnyside, you've got a great variety of plot sizes. And if we move on which you don't see in Waterfall Ridge, and if we move on to the satellite photograph as well, you can quite clearly see that if you look over here, for instance, you've got a mixture of that is a complex, sort of non-detached houses all together. You've got larger blocks of flats there, and you've got normal residential houses, and speckled in between these, every now and again, you see a residential house like over here as well. So you've got a great diversity, not necessarily in uses, but in the forms of land use, of how that land is used. Now, if we go back just a little bit to this here, mixed density thus plays a great role. And the mechanism by which segregation, in a certain sense, this isn't the only thing going on, therefore my hypothesis is that these homogeneous kinds of enclaves that you see here in Waterfall Ridge are really enforced by certain land use conditions. Now, you've got a rich enclave like this, which means you've got a neighborhood where only affluent single families can really afford to stay. And less wealthy sojourners would not so easily be able to navigate this, partly because that means you don't have good integration of transit. It's very difficult to walk large stretches. You don't have very many people using these sidewalks, these pavements. So the existing Tshwane land use scheme prevents higher density development in upmarket suburbs by imposing certain caps on land coverage. This is what I'd mentioned earlier. The recent normative literature is already quite clear on this position, and there seems to be a growing empirical consensus that density restrictions, this is a quote from Lenz and Monkinen, open quote, density restrictions lead to increased income and racial segregation. Further, they say, spatial concentrations of poverty and wealth lead to unequal access to jobs, schools, and safe neighborhoods, and exacerbate negative life outcomes for low-income households. Sunnyside is a lower income neighborhood, higher density, but certainly very mixed density in the eastern parts of it. So instead of a homogeneous Waterkloof, you have a diversity in lot sizes, densities, and use. Small-scale shops and everyday amenities are within walking distance of all residents, making them accessible to those without cars. Housing is not segregated by income, as many kinds of housing exist in proximity, but at least not as strongly segregated, including traditional larger homes on their own plots right next to townhouse complexes and blocks of flats. Planning literature refers to similar suburbs as complete communities, characterized by the availability, roughly within 15 minutes walk, of all the daily necessities that someone would need. The integration of income groups in one space, different plot sizes and housing types and densities. Complete communities represent a drive for racial equity and spatial integration, and this is indeed visible in an area such as Sunnyside East, which sort of by accident bears many hallmarks of a complete community, where a great diversity of ethnic, religious, and income groups live in the same neighborhood. So compare what exists kind of by accident by what has been destroyed and what was purposely a part of the larger project of apartheid, of spatial apartheid, grand spatial apartheid, the enemy were these well-integrated religious, ethnic, and racial areas. Some examples from the United States include the county of Montgomery in Maryland, which embarked on a desegregating policy initiative with its plan for complete communities. The plan acknowledged that, open quote, the separation of uses and associated homogeneity in lot sizes, development standards, and building forms, coupled with the commitment to barriers, buffers, and transitions, which is also typical of apartheid spatial planning, had the effect, whether intentional or not, of discouraging connections among people and races, and reinforcing racial, social, and economic divisions between the country. What's interesting is, and I'm not aware of a court judgment that is as explicit as the New Jersey case of the Southern Burlington County versus the township of Mount Laurel. In that case, the municipal land use scheme, the equivalent of that, imposed the same sorts of minimum plot size, maximum coverage, and caps on density, to the extent that more affordable housing was completely banned in that municipal area. And the court decided that this affirmative action in favor of single-family detached dwellings, one house per lot, etc., had the effect of realistically allowing, open quote, only homes within the financial reach of persons of at least middle income, as the zoning areas required respectively minimum lot areas. Read the rest for yourself. This affirmative action for the benefit of certain segments of the population, the court said, is in sharp contrast to the lack of action and indeed hostility with respect to affording an opportunity for decent housing for the township's own poor living in substandard accommodations. And that, needless to say, such requirements killed realistic housing for this group of low and moderate income families, being the plaintiffs in that case. Now, the court mentioned that such a homogeneous community is kind of a not only boring, but the soulless kind of fossilizing community that really chokes out any growth. And I think South African apartheid urban planning was characterized by the overt and covert pursuit of racial and economic segregation and exclusion, with not co-opting these kinds of practices, but certainly requiring them. And while the grander spatial apartheid legislation might have gone away, we still sit with the nuts and bolts mechanisms by which the spatially segregating goals were achieved. So pursuing complete communities, and that's what I think is interesting about the case that I had just, in Burlington case, is that it might be illegal to plan this way and to impose these kinds of obviously segregating land use conditions. And connecting with what Marianne had just mentioned, how do we undo this? So you must then include not only mixed use, but also mixed density. And I would argue as well social housing, so that on new developments, you impose the requirement that there would be the inclusion of affordable housing in that requirement that can help to address the issue of homelessness. So the most two prominent interventions that I hint at or suggest in the article include zoning reform to reverse the effect of land reservation in favor of the wealthy, and secondly, the adoption of broad, inclusive, and affordable housing initiatives, which do not further marginalize the urban poor.
Thanks, Xander. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.